currently Earth.
It was February 10th in the year 1846 that the Latter-day Saints began their exodus to Utah. With their leader assassinated and their homes under attack, the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as Mormons of Nauvoo, Illinois, begin a long westward migration that eventually brings them to the Valley of the Great Salt Lake in Utah. The members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had been persecuted for their beliefs ever since Joseph Smith founded the church in New York in 1830. Smith's claim to be a modern-day prophet of God and his acceptance of polygamy proved controversial wherever the Latter-day Saints attempted to settle. In 1838, Smith set up a new spiritual colony in Missouri, but by 1839, anti-Mormon prejudice there had proved too virulent. The Latter-day Saints next set up camp in Nauvoo, Illinois, but prejudice followed them there as well. Angry mobs attacked Smith and his brother in June of 1844 and began burning homes and threatening members of the group. Smith and his brother both continued their eternities as a result. Convinced that the Latter-day Saints would never find peace in the U.S., Smith's successor, Brigham Young, made a bold decision. The Latter-day Saints would move to the still wild territory of the Mexican-controlled Southwest. Young had little knowledge of the geography and environment of the West and no particular destination in mind, but trusting in God, he began to prepare the people of Nauvoo for a mass exodus. On this day in 1846, Young abandoned Nauvoo and began leading 1,600 Latter-day Saints west across the frozen Mississippi in sub-zero temperatures to a temporary refuge at Sugar Grove, Iowa. Young planned to make the westward trek in stages, and he determined the first major stopping point would be along the Mississippi River opposite Council Bluffs. He sent out a reconnaissance team to plan the route across Iowa, dig wells at camping spots, and in some cases plant corn to provide food for the hungry immigrants. The mass of Latter-day Saints made the journey to the Missouri River, and by the fall of 1846, the winter quarters were home to 12,000 Latter-day Saints. After a hard journey across the western landscape, Young and his followers emerged out onto a broad valley where a giant lake shimmered in the distance. With his first glimpse of this valley of the Great Salt Lake, Young reportedly said, quote, "This is the place," unquote. That year, some 1,600 people arrived to begin building a new civilization in the valley. The next year, 2,500 more made the passage. By the time Brigham Young continued his eternity in 1877, more than 100,000 people were living in the surrounding Great Basin, the majority of them Latter-day Saints. Young, however, had not escaped the troubles that plagued the church in the East. By early 1848, the Latter-day Saints' haven became a U.S. territory after the American victory in the Mexican War. The Latter-day Saints had finally found a permanent home along the Great Salt Lake, but its isolation and freedom from persecution was short-lived. It was February 10th in 1957 that Laura Ingalls Wilder, author of the best-selling Little House series of children's novels based on her childhood on the American frontier, continued her eternity at the age of 90 in Mansfield, Missouri. Laura Elizabeth Ingalls was born in a log cabin near Pepin, Wisconsin on February 7th in 1867, the second of Charles and Carolyn Quinter Ingalls' 4 daughters. As a child, she lived with her family in Indian Territory in Kansas, as well as in farming communities in Minnesota and Iowa. In the late 1870s, the Ingalls moved to Dakota Territory, settling in present-day De Smet, South Dakota. Laura Ingalls worked as a school teacher in the area, starting in her teens, and in 1885 married Almanzo Wilder, a local homesteader 10 years her senior. In 1886, the couple had a daughter. Their only other child, a son, continued his eternity after his birth in 1889. In 1894, after several years of drought in South Dakota, the Wilders traveled by covered wagon to Mansfield, Missouri in the Ozarks. There, they established a farm. Years later, Laura Ingalls Wilder began contributing essays to local papers. In 1932, Wilder, then in her 60s, published her first novel, Little House in the Big Woods, an autobiographical account of pioneer life in Wisconsin. The book became a success, and she went on to publish 7 more novels based on her experiences growing up on the American frontier in the 1870s and the 1880s. These books, including Little House on the Prairie in 1935, On the Banks of Plum Creek in 1937, and The Long Winter in 1940, chronicle the joys and hardships, including illnesses, crop failures, blizzards, fires, and grasshopper plagues that Wilder and her family experienced. A 9th novel, The First 4 Years in 1971, was published posthumously, as were several other books based on Wilder's journals and letters. Wilder's daughters, Rose Wilder Lane, an author and journalist, is believed to have helped edit her mother's books, although the exact extent of her collaboration is unknown. The Little House books have been translated into dozens of languages and continue to be read by legions of fans. The books also inspired a hit TV series, Little House on the Prairie, which originally aired from 1974 to 1982 and starred Melissa Gilbert as the plucky Laura and Michael Landon as her father Charles. After Laura Ingalls Wilder continued her eternity in 1957, her longtime Missouri home, Rocky Ridge Farm, became a museum. On February 10th in 2014, Shirley Temple Black, who was a child in the 1930s, became one of Hollywood's most successful stars, continues her eternity at her Woodside, California home at the age of 85. The plucky, curly-haired performer sang, danced, and acted in dozens of films by the time she was a teen. As an adult, she gave up making movies and served as a U.S. diplomat. Born on April 23rd in 1928 in Santa Monica, California, Shirley Temple began taking dance lessons when she was 3. In 1932, she was discovered by an agent and cast in a series of short films called Baby Burlesques. Her career took off in 1934 when she appeared in the film Stand Up and Cheer, then went on to star in such movies as Little Miss Marker in 1934, and when she played a girl left with a bookie as an IOU for her father's bet on a horse, or Bright Eyes in 1934, which featured her signature song On the Good Ship Lollipop. The Little Colonel in 1935, the first of 4 films she made with African-American entertainer Bill Bojangles Robinson, and Curly Top in 1935, which included another one of her hit songs, Animal Crackers in My Soup. With America in the midst of the Great Depression, Temple's sunny optimism lifted the spirits of movie audiences and helped make her the nation's top box office draw during the second half of the 1930s. President Franklin Roosevelt, our nation's 32nd president, once proclaimed, quote, "As long as our country has Shirley Temple, we will be all right," unquote. Among Temple's other film credits from this era are Heidi in 1937, Wee Willie Winkie in 1937, and Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm from 1938. Temple's cinematic career cooled when she entered her teens, although she continued to work. The actress married at the age of 17 in 1945, only to divorce in 1949, a year after giving birth to her first child. In December of 1950, she wed businessman Charles Black. In that same month, announced her retirement from movie making. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, Temple, who had 2 children with her second husband, returned briefly to the entertainment business and hosted a TV show. She also became active in California's Republican Party and in 1967 made an unsuccessful bid for the U.S. House of Representatives. In 1969, our nation's 37th president, Richard M. Nixon, named her a delegate for the United Nations General Assembly. In 1972, Temple underwent treatment for breast cancer and became one of the first well-known women to speak about the disease. From 1974 to 1976, she was our nation's 38th president, Gerald Ford's ambassador to Ghana, and won praise for her work in that role. She went on to serve as Ford's chief of protocol from 1976 to 1977. Under our nation's 41st president, President George H.W. Bush, Temple was appointed the U.S. ambassador to Czechoslovakia in 1989 and saw the collapse of communism in that country. In 1999, Temple was named one of the 50 greatest screen legends by the American Film Institute. Joseph Charles Price was one of the founders and the first president of Livingstone College in Salisbury, North Carolina. He was born on this day in 1854. Roberta Flack was born on February 10th in 1940. It was on this day in 1946 that Jackie Robinson married his beautiful wife, Rachel. It was February 10th that the U.S. House of Representatives passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was February 10th in 1992 that Alex Haley continued his eternity.